We are just a short time away from the release of Pokémon Legends ZA, and as the anticipation grows higher and higher during these last few pre-release moments, I have got a wild conspiracy theory that I've been chewing on that I also want to share with you. Now, I did briefly mention this idea in my previous video, but it's honestly so fascinating to me and actually makes a lot of legitimate sense that I wanted to go ahead and dig into it some more and expand on the idea for a full video. And as I started to do that, the pieces just continued to fit into place, which made this idea all the more exciting and interesting. This conspiracy theory is that our rival in Legend ZA, either Urbain or Taunie, is actually from an alternate dimension, and is actually an alternate dimension version of the player character. So yeah, as I said, pretty wild, and that is also why I am dubbing this as a conspiracy theory. I do fully acknowledge this might be just a little too crazy to even remotely be true and could just be totally wrong, but as we wait to ultimately find out, it is a pretty dang interesting idea to explore. I also want to mention that I originally heard this idea mentioned over on the Hidden Power podcast, so be sure to check those guys out, and as I said, I have now just gone ahead and ran with it and started doing my own research to dig more into it. So, with all of that being said, let's go ahead and start diving into the evidence, of which there's actually a lot if you can believe it. The first major eye-catching thing is that Urbain and Taunie are actually identical in appearance to the player characters, minus only their outfits, hair color, and eye color. This was noticed a while ago and is obviously pretty intriguing, but at the time, there wasn't really anything more that we could make of this. Speaking of their hair color though, as one of the few differences in appearance that these rivals have with the player character, it is especially interesting that Urbain and Taunie's hair color matches with that of the Pokémon Legends ZA logo, which naturally would suggest that these rivals could have some major significance within the game if they are in fact being represented within the game's logo, and them secretly being an alternate dimension version of the player character would definitely line up with that level of significance. Another reason why this makes sense is also the reason why this became a possibility in the first place, and that is the DLC for this game. The DLC is called Mega Dimension and has to do with Hoopa, so alternate dimensions are going to be playing a factor here. In fact, it mentions on the ZA website that Hoopa's rings are actually connecting to a place called Hyperspace Lumiose, which sounds as if it very well could be a version of Lumiose City from an alternate dimension. Again, this is what opens up the whole idea as a possibility in the first place, and now that we are made aware of this idea and can start looking around for things to support it, as I've mentioned, details have started to appear that only add to the legitimacy of this idea. For example, a huge facet of the concept of Mega Evolution as a whole has to do with alternate realities. We first learned this in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire when Zinnia said this in the Delta episode: "My people know it. From generation to generation, we pass along the lore about the distortions in the world born by the Mega Evolution mechanisms, and about the existence of another world, which we have long observed to be just like this one, and yet not the same. That's right, a Hoenn region that's almost exactly like this one we live in, filled with Pokemon and people like us." In this context, Zinnia was obviously referring to the timeline where Mega Evolution doesn't exist, and obviously what that meant for the Hoenn region specifically as the setting for that game, but it certainly could apply to other worlds as well, like the one where Hyperspace Lumiose comes from. This place could be an example of the kind of world Zinnia was talking about, that is filled with people like us, and to paraphrase Zinnia, who are like us and yet not the same. And that is exactly who Urbain and Taunie could be in relation to the player character. The exact same people from an alternate dimension. This idea could even serve as the explanation for another unique trait about Urbain and Taunie, which is that only one of them appears in the game, and it is dependent on who you choose as the player character. If you pick the male character, Taunie will appear, and vice versa, meaning that the character who hypothetically would be the alternate you won't actually appear, at least not at the start of the game. The reason why we have this dynamic with the rival could be so that when we go to Hyperspace Lumiose, we end up meeting the other rival character, and that is when it's revealed that they are the alternate version of us. And maybe, just maybe, we would even get to battle them as like a final battle of the DLC. So it would literally be like we were battling against ourselves from a different dimension. Knowing what we got as a final battle in the previous Legends game with Volo, this is something that would certainly live up to that expectation, which I would suspect this game would try to do more or less regardless of what actually happens. And also, Pokémon isn't exactly a stranger to something like this scenario either, because the red battle in Gold and Silver is more or less the exact same thing, where we are battling ourselves from the previous game. However, even if the other rival character does not appear and it's just the one that we meet at the start of the game, they could still be revealed to be from Hyperspace Lumiose in the DLC, and it would still make for an epic moment regardless and still work as far as the theory goes. But personally, if we did actually get to battle the alternate dimension version of us, that would be one of the most peak moments in Pokémon history. And with us recently doing things like that Volo battle, and also battling AI professors after the actual real-life professor was killed by the game's legendary Pokémon, it wouldn't exactly be super inconsistent with what Pokémon has been up to lately. So I honestly do feel like all of that kinda checks out and makes sense, and something else that is also worth mentioning in terms of just bolstering up the idea of this theory is that the rivals are the only member of Team MZ, which is the central group of characters in the game, whose presence in Lumiose City is not explained. It is mentioned that you came to Lumiose to see the sights, Lita came to become a professional dancer, Naveen is here as a fashion designer, but all that is said about Urbain and Taunie is that they live and work at Hotel Z and support the owner however they can. This lack of a backstory, like the other characters have, could be due to the rivals being from Hyperspace Lumiose, which the game obviously does not want to reveal yet. Additionally, them being so closely attached to AZ is certainly eyebrow-raising as well, given who AZ is as a character, and it will also probably add to their significance, which could be tied to this theory. And since this whole idea has to do with the DLC in the first place, it's also important that we focus on it in particular for evidence. We already talked about Hoopa and how it opens up the idea for alternate dimensions in the first place, but the other two mascot Pokemon of this DLC are obviously going to be important to what happens in this DLC as well, and that would of course be Mega Raichu X and Mega Raichu Y. And with all that we've talked about in mind, it is pretty interesting that Mega Raichu X and Mega Raichu Y are essentially alternate versions of each other, just like the rival and the player character might be as well. So making the choice to use a Mega X and a Mega Y Pokemon as the mascot for this DLC could sort of be an intentional way of symbolically representing what is going to be happening in the DLC with the rival and the player character. So, as I mentioned, it really does feel like a lot of pieces are falling into place for this to actually possibly be a thing. It definitely is in conspiracy theory territory though, and could definitely be totally wrong as well. So you will have to let me know all your thoughts about this down in the comments, and leave a like on the video if you enjoyed. Subscribe as well so you don't miss the next one, and until then, as always, thanks so much for watching, I really appreciate it, and I will smell you guys later.